Hello, this lecture is going to cover logical arguments. So, we're going to be looking at different ways that logos are used in persuasive arguments, as well as sometimes the problems that are associated with logical arguments, which are fallacies. So, these are things that you are going to want to look at and look for when you are analyzing other texts, but also while you are writing your own arguments. So we've already gone over ethos and pathos in detail. Um, and the next rhetorical appeal from Aristotle is logos, the logical appeal. And this is an appeal that uses a couple of different things. It can use hard evidence, it can use a claim plus supporting evidence, or a statement plus proof, or an issuance of facts. And so when facts are issued in a logical appeal, we have to remember that even sometimes facts can be arguable. They can still be claims, they can still be debatable, right? So, even if something is kind of accepted as fact, we have to see if it is being used as a reason or a claim. So here are some examples of evidence that can be used in a persuasive argument that uses logos. Um, the most common is things like statistics, surveys, polls, and studies. So this is kind of like that hard evidence, those things that are almost like hard to dispute. Um, and you would use these when you want to verify the popularity of an idea or a proposal. However, there's kind of a caveat to that. You do want to know who conducted the study and how it was done. And the reason that you want to have that background knowledge and present it to your audience is that you want to be able to anticipate scrutiny. Because your audience, whoever they are, they may call into question the study that was done, and so you want to have the context to that study to make sure that you can build your own ethos. You can be seen as trustworthy because your source or your survey or your poll is trustworthy. Another common way that logos is used in arguments is through testimonies, narratives, or interviews. And this is used kind of seldomly. It's not going to necessarily be the bulk of the reasoning and the evidence in an argument. Because it has to be relevant to the claim, and that's where you want to kind of be careful when you are relying on what someone else says, and so you have to analyze those things for accuracy, especially with interviews, right? Have words been twisted? What assumptions are being made? What's the context? What's the background? Who's the interviewer? What kind of bias do they hold? Right? All of those types of things. So, when we are analyzing an argument for logos, one of the things that we need to do is look at the strength of the evidence. So, one way that we can tell that the evidence is maybe on the weaker side is if there's something called circular reasoning. And so this is one of those problems with logical arguments. This is one of those fallacies, right? Where the reason is a repetition of the claim. Maybe you've had this happen before where someone, instead of offering a reason for their argument, they kind of just restate the claim in a different way. And then they present it as a reason. And so that's circular reasoning, and that makes the argument weak. Right. Another fallacy is a hasty generalization, where you use inductive reasoning, which I'll talk about inductive reasoning a little bit later in this lecture. And you use like one or two anecdotes based on the author's own experience. And so that could potentially lead to things like stereotypes or even an appeal to ignorance, right? Like if someone were to argue that like extracurriculars are vital to the college experience. Someone might say, well, I did extracurriculars and I got a job 3 months after I graduated, and so did my friend, right? They're kind of relying on only one or two experiences. And so that's kind of like a quick or snap judgment, right? A hasty generalization, sort of blanketing the entire claim. Okay. Now, when we analyze for the strength of evidence, we want to make sure that the author, or even ourselves, if we're the ones writing, use trustworthy sources. So we need to make sure that the evidence can be verified within those sources. And we also have to analyze the source for the bias, right? What kind of bias does the author hold? Good arguments, strong arguments are going to have a variety of evidence. So they're most convincing when they provide different kinds of evidence, right? The hard evidence, like the polls, the surveys, the studies, but also the testimonials and the narratives. Okay. Now, sometimes what happens when sound evidence is used is something called a non sequitur, and this is another fallacy. And so maybe the evidence is trustworthy, but the author uses it to mislead the audience, and they kind of depend on assumptions that are made. Okay. Now, when logos is used, it's based on reason and common sense, right? So, in addition to like the facts and the statistics, another big part of logos is reason and common sense. And so, something that Aristotle was known for was this idea of enthymemes, right? And so enthymemes are defined by Aristotle as a claim plus a reason. And these are only persuasive when others agree with the underlying assumptions, right? Like, what are the assumptions that are made about the argument that the author's kind of expecting the rest of the audience to agree with? And they end up being persuasive because they rely on common sense. Now, this, enthymemes, right? You've probably heard of like memes on the internet, on social media, right? And so a lot of times memes, they are actually rooted in enthymemes or these underlying assumptions that your audience is just going to get it, right? So here's an example for you. I don't always make memes, but when I do, they contain enthymemes, right? There's an underlying assumption. We're assuming that our audience knows kind of the background of this meme, where it comes from, right? Those types of things. So you guys can kind of go into your own little like rabbit hole on the internet and find memes that are actually enthymemes. Okay. Now, speaking of assumptions, when we are checking the argument's assumptions, we may come across some more fallacies, right? And so if assumptions are being made and they're not rooted in common sense or something that everyone else, the majority of the audience is going to agree with, these are the things, the fallacies that can come up. First is a red herring. So this is an attempt to distract the audience from the main thread of the argument. So they make sort of a subtle diversion using an assumption. Another one is a false analogy, and this is a way of understanding unfamiliar ideas by comparing them with something that is already unknown. And so this can kind of mislead the audience because the author is assuming that, these two things are maybe similar enough to justify their conclusion. And the problem with that is if they're not similar enough. So we have to analyze, are these two things really similar enough to justify a conclusion? Another fallacy is a slippery slope. And this is where you're claiming kind of like this extreme, disastrous cascaded effect will take place if this one thing happens, right? So it's talking about like a chain of events leading to a disaster, saying this will definitely happen, or it's highly probable that this happens if we do XYZ, right? And so that's a slippery slope where, think about it. When you're going down a slippery slope, like there's no way to stop yourself from that. So that's another fallacy. And then the last one, where assumptions can kind of get authors or writers in trouble, is a false cause. And so this is assuming that a first event caused a second without further justification. Right? Like if we were maybe to claim that social media addiction or, things like that among teenagers is solely caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, that would be a false cause because there are lots of different things that maybe have caused this social media addiction among teenagers, young people, whoever, right? Old people, whoever, whatever you want to argue. Um, and so you can't just assume that because COVID-19 happened, there's this effect with social media. You have to kind of consider the whole context. So that's a fallacy that we call a false cause. Okay. When we're analyzing an author's argument, we are going to probably come across some sort of ambiguity where we ask ourselves, what does the writer mean by this? Right? Maybe there's some vagueness. So maybe the author writes something, or maybe you write something where there's many possible meanings to some part of the argument. And when we say that an argument is vague or ambiguous, that's a critique. That's an evaluation of that argument, right? And so we would have to analyze how central the lack of clarity is to the author's main claim. Sometimes authors can get away with a little bit of ambiguity if it doesn't like directly connect to their main claim. We can kind of perhaps excuse that or look for clarification in other ways. But if it's directly connected to the main claim, that can cause a lot of confusion, and even perhaps cause the reader to be misled. Okay, and so one way that ambiguity is used is this idea of equivocation. And so this is using a word in two different ways, but the author acts as if there's only one meaning to the word. And so when an author does this and uses a word assuming that the audience will accept that it's only used in one specific way, that can lead to an unjustified conclusion. Okay. Generalizations. So this is another problem that can happen within logical arguments or the use of the logos appeal. Our textbook tells us that generalizations tell us something is true for a group of cases that have something in common. And so when we're analyzing an argument, we have to ask ourselves, is it always true, or are there cases that don't fit the pattern? And that's going to be even relevant to your own arguments. You have to ask yourself, am I making a generalization? Or are there some exceptions to what all of these things have in common? So here are some additional ideas about generalizations here. The first is this idea of deductive arguments, where an argument starts with a generalization and applies it to a specific case or cases. And then an inductive argument uses examples to make a general claim. Okay, I'm going to show you guys some examples after this. And then finally next we have the false dilemma when, and this is a fallacy, right? When an argument asserts that there are only two or three options when in fact there may be others. And then another fallacy that's a generalization is a loaded question. And so this is when an argument asks a question that has an obvious answer and it kind of pushes the audience to agree with the author, without giving multiple perspectives or multiple possibilities, there's the implication that it's either my way or the highway, right? You're either right or you're wrong. So let's look at some examples of this that might be used in an argument. So a deductive argument would be something like, every mammal needs oxygen to survive. That's a generalization. A whale is a mammal, therefore a whale needs oxygen to survive. So we've applied this generalization to a specific case. Okay. Inductive arguments. Every time I email my professor, she responds within an hour. I emailed her again today. She will probably respond within the hour. So we have this kind of like anecdotal experience, and then we apply it to a generalization, right? And so obviously that can cause some issues. There's even with deductive arguments, right? It makes me think of this song from Veggie Tales, right? Maybe some of you have heard Veggie Tales before. And it's like, if it has a tail, it's a monkey. If there's no tail, it's an ape. And so then it starts to apply that to like every animal, everything, right? And so that's where you can kind of get in trouble with generalizations. And then with the emailing your professor, right? That you can't assume, right? You can't generalize and say that that's going to happen every single time. Maybe those things are just coincidences. And so you have to consider that. Another generalization that's a fallacy, the false dilemma. If we don't ban phones in class, students will never learn anything. And so you can see kind of this like extreme language here that there's no other possibility to this argument. And then the loaded question. Do you support the unfair grading system, right? It kind of like pushes you to be like, okay, well, if it's unfair, then of course, like, I'm not going to support that. But the author here uses kind of manipulative language to make you think that there's like either a right or a wrong answer. Okay. And then finally, when we're looking at arguments or even writing our own, we will analyze counter arguments. And so we want counter arguments to be fair and accurate, present the opposing side or a different perspective in a fair and accurate way. And so sometimes a straw man fallacy happens where the author will distort or exaggerate the counter argument to make it easier to disprove. And that actually it actually weakens the overall argument when they use the straw man fallacy. Now, a lot of students, especially in their own writing, they're like, oh, a counter argument. That means that I have to go and start defending the other side. No, you don't have to do that. We offer a rebuttal. After we offer our fair and accurate counter argument and acknowledge the opposing view, we then show you understand it and then explain it using reasons or evidence why your solution or claim is still the better, more effective one, right? Now, if you have used a straw man fallacy or an author has used a straw man fallacy, then it's going to be easy to offer a rebuttal, right? But if it's a fallacy, it actually weakens your overall argument. So as you guys are going out and you are analyzing other arguments and you're writing your own, you'll want to keep these things in mind.